Hi, I'm Trish from TrishNewbery.com and welcome to the sew along for the robe. The robe today is a woven fabric, so we're going to be sewing with 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowances. And I'm going to finish my raw edges with my serger overlocker. You can use a zigzag stitch, but you will need to find a way of finishing your raw edges. This pattern is not a particularly difficult pattern. There's just a lot of parts and you will be working with a bit of fabric. So talking about fabric, this fabric for this garment is best suited for something beautiful, soft and luxurious. So we're talking satins, so polyester satins, or you could use silks, crepes, just something that flows beautifully. Now, the only problem with sewing with these sorts of fabrics is they can be notoriously slippery. So I'll talk you through it. Don't go for a really cheap satin because you will pay for it at the end, and don't go for a stretch satin either. So what are the main things we need to know when we're working with these sorts of fabrics? Well, you need a really, really sharp needle, so put a fresh needle in your machine. Also, check your stitch length. When I'm sewing with these light fabrics, I like to make mine just a tad longer than normal, and normal for me is 2.5. Alright, so when you're ready, let's get started, and we're going to start on the belt loops. Take a belt loop, fold it right sides together, and we're going to sew a seam at 1 centimetre because we want our belt loop or our tab to end up 1 centimetre wide. Don't forget to back tack at the beginning and end of your seam. Okay, so when you've finished sewing that, turn that through. And if you struggle with these sorts of things, instead of sewing it like I have, hang on, I'll just pull this through and then I will show you. So here is our belt loop, but if you struggle sewing them like this, what you can do is just press both edges under by 1 centimetre, and then press them like so, and then just stitch that edge together. So go and plug your iron in. You're going to be needing your iron quite a lot for this. So go and plug your iron in, and then iron these belt loops so that that seam edge is right on the very edge, and then fold them in half like so. And if you need to, just pop a pin in the end to hold those ends together. Take your garment back and place it right side up, and here is the curve at the underarm, and come down until you find the first notch. So match that tab there and just run a tack stitch. So we want to just put a couple of stitches to hold that in place, and we want to do that within the seam allowance. So stitch them anything around about 1/4 of an inch in from the edge, which is 6mm, and then do the same thing on the other side. So we want all the raw edges to match. So it's the first notch down from the armhole. And we want that to sit perpendicular to the seam, so at right angles. Now I'm going to work on the side seam pockets. Now with my serger overlocker, I'm only using 3 threads. I'm using a wide 3 threads, so I'm using my left looper and my 2 lower ones. I'm not going to worry about my middle one. And we only need 3 threads because we're just using it to tidy the seam up with, to trim off any stray threads or any fraying. So there's no need to have 4 threads on this. You can if you want. 4 threads is generally only for structural sewing on mitts. So here are our pockets. We have 2 pairs, 4 mirrors, so we have 2 this way and 2 that way. Now I'm going to edge tidy just 2 of them. So we need 2 mirrors or 1 pair to be edge tidied on the edge with the notch. So I'm only going to edge tidy the straight edge, and there's a notch here and a notch here at either end. And make sure you can still see your notches underneath that. So once you've edge tidied the straight edge on a pair or 2 mirrors of those pockets, we're going to go back to our straight stitcher. Take the pair of pockets that you haven't overlocked, so that have no edge finishing, and we're going to sew those onto the back. So place your back right side up and place one of those pocket pieces right side down just underneath the pocket tab, and you will find that the notch under the pocket tab will match to the pocket top here, and you'll have another notch to match there. What we're going to do is stitch this pocket down, and we want to stitch it at a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we're just going to stitch between those notches. So start directly opposite the first one. Remember to back tack. And stop directly at the bottom one, opposite the bottom notch. And back tack. And now do the same thing on the other side. Take the pair, the 2 mirrors that you have edge stitched, and we're going to sew those to either side of the front. So take one of the fronts, and this is the left front as you wear it here, and do exactly the same thing. Make sure you have right sides together and that the pocket's facing down. And you want to make sure you get the right notch. So the first notch will be not the notch you need. The first notch is the one that will match to the belt tabs when we stitch this together. And we are going to sew this to the second one down. So you should be able to see through your serging the notch. So match a notch here. And the notch at the lower edge, and stitch those together exactly the same way. Now we're going to make a very small snip, so we want to do this like so. So we want to cut a snip from the side seam up towards the end of our stitching, and we want to stop just a couple of millimeters short of the stitching. So we just create a snip like that, angled up, and at the bottom we do the same thing, angled down. So you just want to leave a very small gap like so. So when you've done that, turn your pocket over so we have right sides up, and I want to edge stitch. So we want to edge stitch through all these layers, and we want to do it between the stitching line again, so it will be exactly between the notches, and don't forget to back tack. So we're doing this as an edge stitch, which is literally a pin width from the edge of that stitching line. And this will just help create roll to the wrong side. So that's what we're going to do. So do that for the other side as well. Don't press it yet. Take one of your fronts and match it to your back and match the pocket together, and we will have notches that need to match on the pocket. So we're going to sew around the pocket at a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So just match the beginning points there. Okay, so go ahead and edge tidy that with zigzag or your overlocker. When you've done that, go ahead and repeat that on the other side. Okay, so now we just leave the pocket and we are going to jump ahead and do the shoulders. Match your shoulder seam together and we're going to sew this at a 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance from the edge of the armhole all the way through to the neck. And once you've sewn that seam, go ahead and edge tidy it with your serger or a zigzag. Now do that for the other shoulder and then go to your iron and press those seams so they face towards the back of your garment. Now we're working on the sleeves. So we have 2 sleeves. They've been cut on the fold and the fold is this edge here. At the very edge here there's a small notch. Now we need that notch, and so this is where we're going to sew the sleeve to the garment. So have a look for this curve here. So take your garment and place it right side together to this edge here at the sleeve. Because the sleeves are identical, so there's 2 of them cut the same, it shouldn't matter which one you pick up. So here is my garment and here is that shoulder seam that we sewed earlier. So what we want to do is place the sleeve to there and we want to match that notch that was on the fold to the shoulder seam in the centre. And here you can see that seam's pressed towards the back. And we're going to sew that line. So we're sewing this at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and don't forget to back tack. Okay, so go ahead and edge tidy that edge and then repeat that on the other side. So when that's sewn, go to your iron and press that seam so that it faces towards the wrist area. So we want that seam there to face down. Now it's time to sew the side seams and the underarm. So this is the same for either the banded sleeve edge view or the hemmed sleeve edge view. So fold your garment right sides together and we're going to start sewing at what is going to be the wrist area. Now if you have the banded view, there's no notches. If you have the seam view, you'll find a notch at 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch. So what we're going to do is just match our notches and sew that seam, and then when you're finished, go ahead and serge, overlock or zigzag that edge. Make sure you match the notches as you go. It's especially important because if you're probably working with a slippery fabric, you want to make sure everything's sitting in the right place. Now the best suggestion I can have if you are sewing with something slippery is match your notches, and when you sew that seam, pull it quite taut. Just find it makes things sit better. So we're coming to the curve on the sleeve, not the underarm, just the curve on the sleeve. Now we're going to sew up towards the underarm and make sure those underarm seams match. You want them sitting on top of each other. We're now approaching the area where the tab is, so the belt loop is. So make sure that that belt loop is on the inside because we'll match those notches. And we also need to look at our pocket because we don't want to stitch the pocket closed. Now I'm sewing the left hand side of the garment as if you're wearing it. So it'll be the other way around for the other side. So what I'm doing is I'm going to make sure this entire pocket is all lined up nicely and it's all sitting on the front like that. So we want all the layers to the front. And remember those little angles we cut out, those little snips we cut out? We want to make sure that they are flipped around so that the pocket sits nice and flat. And we want all those layers to face towards the front. So when we get to this area here, we want it to look like that there, with all the layers there. And we're going to sew through, making sure that belt loop is still at right angles here. So there's the belt notch. When we stitch down, we want to come down so that our stitching comes down and just overlaps the existing stitching at the notch by about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. So that's what we want. We want all of the pocket layers to face on the front because this is the back. And I've snapped off here, so I've cut my thread off here because we want to obviously make sure there's room for our hand to go in. So come to the bottom end of the pocket and rearrange. So just get it all sitting nice and flat. So we want to make sure all that pocket, including that little tab or that little slice we cut, the trim piece, is all pushed out so that that entire pocket is sitting towards the front. And then we want to overlap that by about 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and start stitching again, making sure we've left that gap for our hand. And then continue matching notches and sew down to the hemline. And this is the same whether you're sewing the midi view or the maxi view. Now I've said maxi view, it's actually floor length. This long view is really long. It's designed to be very glamorous. So floor length is floor length for a person who would be 5'6". So you may prefer to sew the midi view, or if you're not sure, what you can do is sew the maxi view and then you can cut the hem off shorter at the end. That's an easiest way of doing it if you're not happy with the length of it. Okay, so I will now do that same seam on the other side to show you what it's like doing it from the other side. I'll just speed up the first part of the wrist sewing. Okay, so here is the pocket from the other side. Here is my tab, so I've just matched that. So make sure all the pocket is folded over towards the front, and those little snips that we cut out are pushed into the seam allowance there. Smooth that all down and then stitch. And remember, we want to overlap that. Then we want to leave that area free. Come to the other side of the pocket, the other end of the pocket. Make sure all that messy stuff is all pushed out into the seam. And of course this looks worse because I'm sewing this in a slippery satin, so it all looks nasty, but we'll tidy that up with our serging in a second. And all those, see there's that little trimmed piece, that little angle tail. So start overlapping there, back tack, and stitch down to the hemline. Okay, so now we're going to serge tidy this edge, and we literally tidy the entire edge. You're going to catch that entire pocket as you go down. So start at the wrist and serge down and serge right through here, because we want to tidy up those layers there, all the way through to the hemline. So go ahead now and give your garment a really good press. Okay, so if you're sewing the sleeve band view, you're going to have two bands, so fold them in half lengthwise, and we're going to stitch together these short ends at 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. And then go to your iron and press that seam open like so. There's no need to finish that raw edge, so we want to press it open. When you have that pressed open, now what we're going to do is press again lengthwise, but we want to press it like so, and we want to make sure that these raw edges are together. So when you're finished, this is what it will look like. Now what I'm going to do just for this garment is I am going to put a lace overlay on it. So what I've done is I've done exactly the same thing with some lace and just sandwiched it around. So I'll continue sewing it with the lace, but yours, there's no difference. Mine's just got an extra layer, so yours will look like this. And before we go any further, the seam here needs to go at the underarm wrist. Okay, so this is the underarm wrist sleeve on my seam on my garment, so I'm going to match that seam to the seam here, and I'll hold that in place with a pin, and then as we go along there will be other notches to match, so just find those notches and make sure they match. Now I'm just going to sew this into place with a 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam. I just need to make sure all my raw edges match up. Okay, so I'm just going to go to my overlocker and serge edge tidy that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is go to my iron and I'm going to press that seam, and I want to press that seam up. If you're sewing the hemmed view with the sleeves, The hem on the sleeves is exactly the same as the hem on the body. You can just sew those hems later. So all you're going to do is, there is a 2 centimeter, 3/4 of an inch seam allowed for. So you can either edge stitch that edge, press it at that length, at that width, and then stitch it down, or you could double fold 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, and press that down, whichever look you prefer. Alright, so now let's move on. Now we're going to sew the internal ties. So these are exactly the same as the belt loops. Fold them right sides together and stitch a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam. And then using a turning tool, or whatever your preferred method is, turn those so they are wrong sides together or right sides out. And then go to your iron and press them so that that seam is right on the very edge. And of course repeat for the other one. Take one of the ties and hem the end. Now you can probably get away without it if you wanted to, but what I'm going to do is just fold it under twice. Of course, another way to do it is you could have sewn the end in before you turned this, but that could be a bit more challenging to you. So just turn it under by 6mm and another 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch, and just sew a teeny little hem across the end there, like so, and then just tidy it up. And then take your garment and come to the side seam just above the pocket area and locate where the belt loop is. What we're going to do is take our tie and stitch it directly on top. So I'm just going to turn that under by about 6mm, 1/4 of an inch, and stitch that on top of the belt loop. I'm going to stitch this twice. I'm going to stitch exactly on the side seam, and then I'm going to stitch on the other side of it, which should be just on the overlocking or edging line. Of course, if you were really organised, you could have put this in at the same time as you were sewing your side seam as well. But that is fine, and that just hides the edge. So we've got a nice little tidy internal tie, and that's just to stop our gown from flapping open. For the other tie, sew another little hem on the edge, 6mm, 6mm, 1/4 inch, 1/4 of an inch, double turn. And now for this one, you might need to go back to your pattern piece. So where we're going to sew this one in is, it's going to get sandwiched in the front band. So come to the left side as you wear it, and you will see 2 notches quite close together. So there's one there, and the other one, I might have to go back to my pattern. But you find the 2 notches that are close together. Oh, there we are. So there's 1 notch there and 1 notch there. And what we want to do is tack it within the seam allowance at right angles to this. So just find that the 2 notches together, it's the uppermost notch, and just tack stitch that down at 1/4 inch, 6mm. We're going to catch that one in when we sew the band. So now it's time to move on to the band. Take your band pieces and place them right sides together, and we're looking for the end that has a notch right in the center here. And we're going to sew these 2 edges together at 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. And then we're going to go to our iron and press that seam open. Okay, now come down to the end and fold it right sides together. and we're going to stitch across the short end at 1 centimetre, and we're going to do this at both ends of this band. Okay, so now we're going to turn that through and press that band together so that the raw edges match. Now I'm going to jump ahead and edge finish my hemline before I sew the band on, so you can choose to do this or not. I suggest you do this if you're going to do a standard overlock, turn up and stitch down method. So all I'm going to do is just edge tidy the very raw, the very end edge of my garment. So now let's sew on the band. So just a note about sewing on the band before we start, because the upper part of this front is cut, essentially it's not quite on the bias, but you'll find it's going to have moved, especially because the fabric you're going to be using is going to be something really slippery like a satin. So you can use an old-fashioned technique called stay stitching, which is a bit like an ease stitch in to hold that into place. But you're just going to have to see what works for you as you go up there. It's really going to depend on how much your fabric has moved because of that bias. Okay, so we're going to start at a hem edge. There is a notch 2 centimeters from the end. Now that is our hem allowance, so we have to make sure that that is maintained. So if yours has moved, make sure you put that at the 2 centimeter line like so. So what we're going to do is just sandwich this band at the hemline 2 centimeter position. So put that at the notch and then wrap that around and stitch in a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now there's lots of notches to match as you go. Okay, so it's from here on up that our bias is going to, or our centre front is probably going to have started to move. I'm just pinning my next notch into place. So I've got quite a bit I need to take up, so I'm just going to make sure I ease this in just really gently as I go. And as I said, you can stay stitch through here and maybe draw it up like you would sometimes setting in a fitted tailored shirt. What I tend to find works better is just to lift my presser foot every couple of stitches and just ease the excess in. So I just sew a couple and then release the tension off. So that actually brought quite a lot of it in. It's a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. And there's still quite a lot left to go between there and the shoulder to bring in though. So I'll just make sure those notches match. And now I'll do it again up to the shoulder. There's an awful lot to have to ease in here. Then you want to fold that over so that your 2 centimeters hem allowance is maintained, and stitch that through. Like so. And now we're going to go and edge tidy those raw edges. So when you have edge tidied that, just turn it through like so and press. And while you're at it, you can then turn up your hem by 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch, and press that into place as well. Come to the area where we've sewn that tie into the band, and this part is optional, but what I do find is it makes your garment sit better. Bring your tie around and we're going to stitch it down to the very edge of the band on the fold. It just makes our garment makes the band sit flatter when you're wearing it. So just make sure that that is all sitting the correct way and stitch on the very edge here at right angles to the seam. So just a couple of stitches backwards and forwards. Like so. So my band is all pressed into place, and now I'm going to sew my hem of my garment. So I'm just going to stitch a hem with my straight stitch, and I'm going to sew directly through my overlocking line, my serging line. I'm actually just going to stitch this from the front just because I think I'm going to get a better result from it. But of course you just do whatever works for you, and I'm starting directly on the line that joins to the band. I'm just going to sew it from one side to the other. Here is my belt. What I'm going to do is fold it in half, right sides together, and we're going to stitch around the raw edges at 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. We need to leave a gap for turning, so what I suggest you do, so you just stop 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch before the end with your needle down, lift, turn and pivot, and keep sewing. So we have notches to match as we go, and what I suggest you do, because there is a notch for the centre, which was where the fold was, and I'll come to that in a second, and I'll show you what I think is a really good thing to do when you're doing belts. So I like to leave my gap around about the centre, so find that centre notch, and you just need to leave an opening, so maybe 3 inches, 8 centimetres or so. It doesn't have to be directly in the centre back, it could be to one side or another of it. So I'm just going to stop and back tack. I'm going to leave myself a gap, just room enough to help me turn, and I'll start stitching on the other side and then keep matching notches until we get back to the equivalent starting position. Turn your belt through and then go to your iron and press the belt with that seam right on the very edge, and then come to the opening area, and when you've pressed, the easiest thing is just to maintain that 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then just stitch that opening closed with an edge stitch. So we're just going to stitch it there. I mean, you could stitch right round the belt, it's really not necessary. You're not even going to notice this. So just stitch that closed and give your garment a final press, and congratulations, you're finished. Thanks for joining me with this sew along. Thanks for buying my patterns. If you enjoy the video, please hit the thumbs up button and also the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. And thanks as always for buying my patterns and supporting a small business. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to see your makes on my Facebook page, and I hope to see you again soon for my next sew along video.